Hi, I'm Nathalie Edmond, licensed clinical psychologist and owner of Mindful and Multicultural Counseling. If you've checked out some of my other videos, you know that I'm talking about white supremacy, the history of racism, and things that we can do to start to change the way that we operate in this world so that everybody can be free, so that all lives can truly matter. If you're joining me for the first time, welcome, and I hope that you bring some curiosity about some of the things we'll be exploring. Today I'm going to focus on basically what white people can do. So I've kind of explained a little bit about the system of white supremacy, which really is the foundation of the United States, which basically says that whiteness is the preferred race, and that there is a deep anti-blackness culture that's embedded in the United States that started with all of the enslaved people for hundreds of years, as well as the kind of original foundation of this country, which was eradicating the indigenous people. So I'm continuing to take some excerpts from Ruth King's book, Mindful of Race. So here's the book, Mindful of Race by Ruth King. It's excellent. It talks about a really mindful and compassionate way to address racism. And I just want to read some things, because she's done a lot of anti-racism trainings, and she has a list of things the white people commonly say when the topic of race comes up. I don't see color. Aren't we all the same? Race is an illusion. Why are people of color so attached to this concept? Let it go. I'll just listen. I know I have a lot to learn. Besides, I'm likely to say something stupid and get nailed again. I don't know what I don't know. People of color need to teach me about race, tell me what to do. Why are people of color so angry with me? I wasn't living at the time. I don't know how to have this conversation without feeling blamed, guilty, frustrated, or angry. I'm oppressed in other ways, so I know what it feels like to be a person of color. We can't really talk about race because there aren't enough people of color in the room. And then people of color commonly say, right, we're going to talk about race. This means that in addition to being disturbed by white people's ignorance, I'm going to have to teach white folks what they choose to deny knowing, amnesia of whiteness. I'm angry about race, but if I talk about it, I'm labeled the angry person and nobody listens. Right, we're going to talk about race. That means we're going to talk about black folks and white folks. I'm neither. Why should I care? I'm invisible. Race is a concept. Why can't I just get over it? When will white people take responsibility for their collective impact on other races throughout the world? I don't want to keep educating white people about race. They need to do this for themselves. I don't need to be friends with white people. I just want them to stop getting in my way and stop doing harm. I'd like to be able to focus on something other than race for a change, but people who look like me keep getting harmed. So you see that we have these two very different experiences. One of the things I really appreciate about Eastern philosophy is this idea of ultimate reality versus relative reality, or multiple truths, as some people like to call it. So ultimate reality is this idea that all lives matter, right? That we are all connected, we are all one, right? That there is worth in every human being, right? And so ultimate reality is kind of what is kind of the ideal. And relative reality is what's actually happening in this time period, in this moment, right? And relative reality says that some people have power and some people don't. That some lives are treasured and privileged and some are not, right? That there wouldn't need to be a slogan of Black Lives Matter if the statement all lives matter actually and truly and systematically included Black and brown bodies. So I often think about how do we hold these multiple truths? Because I think part of the problem of why it's so hard for us to talk about race is because we were never really taught the tools of how to sit in discomfort. So I've shared another video called Rain, which is a form of meditation of how to sit with distress. Because if you're going to actually embark on these dialogues with people, it's going to bring discomfort, right? Because we have been conditioned to either not see race and be colorblind, or to be really fearful of how talking about race will push away people we love or people we want to be in relationship with. So I'm just going to give you some things to kind of think about, right? Is that if you are a white identifying person, right, I think that you have some responsibility because of white fragility to create space to lift up the voices of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, because the system is built to not create space for them. So I think you have to do your own work, right? I highly recommend affinity groups, right? Is gathering some people who have a similar racial identity and starting to read books and watch films and discuss these topics, right? You don't need a person of color in your group to have these dialogues, and it's actually probably less harmful to not have it, because otherwise oftentimes people of color do a lot of the emotional labor. They end up stirring up their own past traumas of race, and it allows oftentimes white people to be silent, right? And that there are many ways for you to get this information that does not involve the emotional labor of people of color. Now that's different if you have already intimacy and that's already part of the dialogues that you two already have. That's different. So I highly encourage you to find people who you can have these dialogues with and to practice being in discomfort, right? To shore up the resources that you need to be able to have this discomfort. And to allow yourself to have spaces where you can really have your feelings, so that when people of color are sharing with you, that you can hold the space for them and that they don't have to take care of you. Because I remember being challenged. I don't know if I was challenged. I was invited to think about the ways in which I take care of white people, right? And I mean, I spent a lot of my professional career, probably the first decade or, first few decades of my life, really knowing how to navigate predominantly white spaces in a way that I was less harmed, right? And that was to kind of be quiet. I learned a way of speaking that was non-threatening. And it took a long time for me to train myself to find spaces where I could speak out. And so thinking about, many Black, Indigenous, people of color have learned the strategies to navigate a predominantly white world in which they know about white fragility. You may not know about white fragility, but they know not to touch certain buttons. And, back to this concept of white people are part of a group when they often think about themselves as individuals. And people of color often think of themselves as part of a group rather than individuals, meaning they recognize that the way that they act is reflected on their race. That's kind of the pressure that they tend to have. Also, that there is a sense of shared racial trauma. When you see someone who looks like you being treated as if they don't matter, you feel that in your heart, in your spirit, and you can't help but perhaps be sad or angry or worried about what will happen to you and your loved ones of similar identities. So I'm inviting white people to really do their own internal work. Sometimes it's easier to point at the extremes, right? What we consider like explicit racism. But there is so much underground racism, right? That racism is not a yes or no. It is a continuum. And on one end is anti-racism, where I am actively trying to challenge and dismantle racism. And so there are many ways on a daily basis that we are biased, right? We have something called microaggressions, which is where stereotypes that we learn consciously or unconsciously, we play out through microaggressions, right? And so you might not have heard this phrase, but microaggressions, some people talk about it, it's like death by 1,000 cuts, because it's not so explicit, right? So an example of a microaggression would be like, if I call someone and, they can't see my face, and then later they find out that I'm Black, they're like, oh, you spoke so eloquently, right? That there's a little dig in there, because the assumption is that Black people don't tend to speak eloquently. And so there are all these little microaggressions that can happen that are really draining for a person of color. But yet it's not so blatant as being called, let's say, the N-word, right? So it's harder to address, but you feel the weight of that. So I want you to think about, what are the different roles, right? Let's talk about power. That white people as a group have power in the system. Even if you as an individual don't see that you have that much power, as a race, you have a lot of power in this system. And so that means when you're thinking about having conversations with people, to really think about power in terms of your groups, right? So a white person talking to a white person, the power is a little bit more equal, right? Relatively speaking, right? We can think about other identities that people have in terms of class and sexual orientation and gender and things like that kind of, that intersectionality that impacts things. So thinking about, what's your power in this relationship? Are you coming from the oppressed group or the oppressor group, right? And so if you are the person with the privileged power, then you have to create space to be heard, even if to hear what's being told to you, right? I've heard some people talk about white people are being invited to listen. And so that means that you just create space to hear what people have to say without necessarily asking them to explain and educate you, without defending things, and to really validate their experience, even if you don't get it. And then to hold the space for them, and then do your own work outside of that relationship to get up to speed or to wrestle with it. And then people who are from the oppressed group, to really think about ways in which you perhaps tend to be quiet, even when the risk of harm is not that great. And are there ways in which we can start to move out of kind of being frozen or silence and speak our truth, whatever that might be? And that white people who tend to be quiet, how do you push yourself past your comfort zone a couple of degrees to be able to share what's happening, right? Feeling guilt or shame is a stage. You don't have to stay there. Feeling despair is a stage. You don't have to stay there, right? So just imagine the momentary times that you feel those feelings related to the discussions of race, that people of color probably feel that on an almost daily basis, if not daily basis. I want you to also kind of think about, if you have multiple identities and some of them are privileged and some of them are oppressed, to kind of think, in this dialogue that we're having, which identity is front and center? Which identity are we really talking about, right? Because one way that we shut down conversations is that, let's say I'm a white person, let's say I am a white cis female, and I'm also queer, right? That I might kind of deflect the white privilege to focus on being female and being queer, right? And I'm in no way saying that those identities are not marginalized, because they are. And yet, if the conversation is centered on race, let's keep it on race. Otherwise, we're invalidating the experience. So I would love to see people have deeper, meaningful conversations. And I think we need to move away from black and white, right? How do we call people into the conversation, not call them out? People ultimately want to be part of a tribe. They want to be connected. They don't want to be shamed. They don't want to be exiled. And many people are afraid. Underneath anger is often fear. So how do we call people in? How do we invite them into the dialogue, right? Thinking about like cutting people out of your life, that is a privilege, right? And I love, I think, I've heard Ruth King say it, I've heard other kind of social justice people talk about how white people have to call their people in, right? I mean, it's so much easier to talk to someone who shares a similar racial identity, right? Because some defenses are down and you're coming from a somewhat shared experience. And so that is the work that you can do, right? I think being anti-racist comes in a lot of different flavors, right? Some people are going to write letters and call their congressman. Some people are going to do marches and protests. Some people are going to live in a particular area, go to a particular school district. Some people are going to buy from people of color businesses. Some people are going to try to diversify the foods and experiences and the people and friendships that they have. They're going to try to teach their kids particular things. Like, these are all forms of ways of being anti-racist, right? And for a person of color, sometimes just resting is an act of rebellion. Sometimes just walking in spaces unapologetically is an act of rebellion, because this country was not designed for people of color to thrive. It was designed for them to be oppressed, for wealth to be built on their backs. So for me, meditation and yogic practices and loving kindness meditations, they help me drop in to myself. They help me breathe and ground myself, to connect and know what my feelings are and what part of myself is being activated when I'm stirred up, and helps me find loving ways to bring people into conversation. Because I believe that deep down inside, we all want the same thing. Yet we've been conditioned to think that there is not enough for everybody. And we've been conditioned to think that the system is equal, and that if people just work hard enough, that they can achieve the same thing. So we have to start to break these things down, but first we have to settle in and arrive and bring our curiosity. Thank you for spending some more time with me. I wish you well on this journey and awaking into possibilities of us reimagining the ways in which everybody can be free. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace.